Good morning. So this is our second class of the day, and this is a really exciting session. It's definitely different from a lot of our other ones, but I'm really excited about hearing this. I think it's really important. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, and then we will get started. So today's speaker is a 25-year-old naval officer, currently in her third year of her doctoral degree in clinical psychology at George Washington University. In 2017, she graduated with an MA in forensic psychology, summa cum laude. And sorry, my screen's kind of giving me a hard time. And she received her second in clinical psychology in August of 2020. In addition to being a full-time student, she's also seeing patients via teletherapy. She's committed to combating human trafficking while promoting, educating, and bringing awareness to the billion-dollar industry to schools, businesses, administrators, law enforcement, and parents. She's currently a volunteer with FAIR, Free, Aspire, Inspire, and Restore Girls, where she conducts presentations, webinars, trainings, and provides resources to victims. She's actively involved with national organizations such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and National Center for Victims of Crime, as well as the Georgia-based National Initiative Demand an End. My screen's kind of popping on and off for me. She's an active member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated and enjoys reading, traveling, and spending time with her puppy, Knowles, who is named after Beyonce. I love that. Today's presenter is from the Miss DC organization, Adhd Medina.
Thank you, Karolyn. Thank you so much. So I will get started, and I'll also put it in the chat for folks that are coming in. Please feel free to introduce yourselves as you enter, just so I can have an idea of like who's with us today and we can feel more connected. I want to make this as interactive as possible because I know how heavy this content can be, but it's also really interesting content and something that I'm really passionate about. So let me see, this is technology. So again, as Karolyn just introduced, my name is Adhd Medina. I'm 25 years old. I'm Black and Puerto Rican, a doctoral candidate at GW. I also have my master's in forensic psych and my master's in clinical psych, and I'm a licensed psych associate in DC, which allows me to provide therapy and assessment services, as well as being a naval officer and a dog mom to Knowles. So today's game plan will be intersectionality, racial disparities in the mental health field, differences in mental health concerns based on race, and the historical context of race and mental health, as well as a discussion, some questions for us to think about together. So I believe setting the frame is very important, and wanted to start with this amazing TED Talk on intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. We won't watch the whole thing, probably just about 11 minutes or so, but I really would urge you to watch to the end on your own time. In me speaking today, our topics will cover intersectionality, of race and gender, because I also think social justice is an integral part of this, and it is important to understand the frame and the construct of which we are speaking. So I will hit play.
I'd like to try something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up. Okay, so I'm gonna name some names. When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're gonna see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner. Mike Brown. Tamir Rice. Freddie Gray. So those of you who are still standing, I'd like you to turn around and take a look. I'd say half to most of the people are still standing. So let's continue. Michelle Cusseau. Tanisha Anderson. Ara Russer, Megan Hockaday. So if we look around again, there are about 4 people still standing. And actually, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I just say that to encourage transparency, so you can be seated. So those of you who recognize the first group of names know that these were African Americans who've been killed by the police over the last 2.5 years. What you may not know is that the other list is also African Americans who have been killed within the last 2 years. Only one thing distinguishes the names that you know from the names that you don't know: gender. So let me first let you know that there's nothing at all distinct about this audience that explains the pattern of recognition that we've just seen. I've done this exercise dozens of times around the country. I've done it to women's rights organizations. I've done it with civil rights groups. I've done it with professors. I've done it with students. I've done it with psychologists. I've done it with sociologists. I've done it even with progressive members of Congress. And everywhere, the awareness of the level of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low. Now, it is surprising, isn't it, that this would be the case? I mean, there are 2 issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women. 2 issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them, no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them. Policymakers don't think about them. And politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired. And she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraff and Reed was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
So I know that for today's discussion, we will focus on race, but I do encourage you again to think about how this plays out with gender, religion, sexual identity, and everything else as well. This is also something that we see in the mental health field, where oftentimes people do just focus on race and don't see how all of those other things intersect into a person's identity and to ultimately the problems that they come in, or the concerns they come into therapy for. Again, the information today will be heavy, but the reason why this is important and why I'm passionate about it is because of my work with my patients. And you may wonder how this relates to you. So I hope that you keep that in mind as you're watching, and keep these themes of intersectionality in mind as well. As you read this quote, I want you to think about what it is saying. And it's essentially saying that pathologizing people's history and experiences as a disorder ultimately leads them to have barriers to not want to come to seek mental health services. And so one could think about a Black person's hypervigilance being seen as paranoia, versus a mental health clinician understanding its very real cultural basis in society. So I think about one of my patients who is a Black woman, who at the onset of the pandemic, police brutality, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and the verdict of Breonna Taylor and the subsequent death of Chadwick Boseman and countless others, shared that she feels the world is impinging in on her, that she has depression, and before she could come into sessions and focus on how that's impacting school or her relationships. And while she always knew the role that race played, it never felt as strong or as prevalent as it felt to her now, where she feared for her life and wondered, is her depression just hers? Is it of the world? Is it because of society? When Breonna Taylor was murdered, or Meg Thee Stallion was shot, she questioned if it could be her. To someone else, maybe somebody of a different race, that would sound like paranoia. That would sound extreme to think about or to question. But to me, as a Black woman, I heard it, and it took everything in me not to cry, because I felt that I was living the very same reality. And so that's where it becomes important to have clinicians that are versed in these things, culturally competent or representative of somebody's culture, so that they can know not to pathologize the things that people are sharing. So as an overview, approximately 18% of the United States adults are diagnosed with a mental disorder, and 4% of that population have what is considered a serious mental illness. Mental disorders are amongst the leading cause of disability in the United States, and 13.6% of life lost to premature death. Mental disorders are also among the most costly health conditions for adults, and it's estimated that 43% of people with mental illness receive mental health care in a year. I want you to hold these in mind as we continue to break down mental health overall in diverse populations and then within each racial group. With all this being said, and our theme being intersectionality, it's also important to think about the fact that the United States population is continuing to become more diverse. And by 2044, more than half of all Americans are projected to belong to a minority group, which is considered any group other than non-Hispanic whites. So this is again an overview of racial disparities that we see. Racial minorities often bear a disproportionately high burden of disability resulting from their diagnosis. Youth who fall into the category of both being racial minorities and having behavioral health issues are more likely to be referred to the juvenile justice system than to have specialty primary care. Minorities are also more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system due to harsh disciplinary suspension and expulsion practices in schools. Mental health concerns are also common amongst people in the criminal justice system, which also has a disproportionate representation of racial minorities. Approximately 50% to 75% of youth in the juvenile justice system meet criteria for a mental health disorder. People who identify as being two or more races, so someone like me, are more likely to to report any mental illness than any other racial group. And then that's followed by American Indian, Alaska Natives, white folks, and Black folks. White Americans are more likely to die by suicide than people of any other racial group, and a lack of cultural understanding by healthcare providers may contribute to a mis or underdiagnosis of a mental illness in people from racially diverse populations. So a way that we're currently seeing the last point play out is within diagnosing young Black boys with ADHD. And then what we find is that this impacts them long term because it's sort of told to teacher to teacher to teacher as they advance in school, and it affects the way the teachers view them, the way that they teach them, and subsequently how the student then performs. Because what we have found is that kids are able to perceive people's perception or view of them and then perform as such. This also relates to over medication and psychiatry, but that is a whole nother topic. So I think this is interesting and would love to hear you all's thoughts. It breaks down the folks of diverse populations of mental illness in any past year versus the folks actually receiving that care, that service. And so I want to open the floor briefly just to hear your thoughts on what do you think the barriers to that care may be. Karolyn, you're muted.
Whitney, do you want to? Okay, Whitney says access to care.
Okay. Yes, definitely.
Yep, definitely. I think some along the lines of access to care, physical barriers too, about how far care is, wait times, things like that. If you have to work and you're not able to take off work or take off work to get your child to care, then that's gonna make a huge impact as well.
Yeah, that's a very true point, especially in DC. Granted, DC is tiny, so you can imagine this on a global scale. But most mental health physicians may practice in Northwest, which is a predominantly more gentrified area, seen as more wealthy. And so if you're trying to get the folks in Southeast or Southwest, granted, you would think it's easy, but they have to travel all the way to Northwest. There's also just maybe the shame, the burden of all that. So you have to think, if you want to serve a specific population, make sure you're in the community that they are in and not forcing them to come to you. So that's a great point. So yes, barriers to care, lack of insurance or underinsurance that cost, the stigma of mental health, which is often greater among minority populations. Again, the lack of diversity among mental health care providers. I believe last time I checked, only 2% of all mental health care providers were Black. Language barriers and distrust in the healthcare system, which we will get to later. There's also the inadequate support for mental health services in our insurance field. So Medicaid, health insurance coverage, how high do they make the copay? How much do they prioritize or normalize mental health services like they do any other routine checkup? So this is also something that I found interesting, is the top 10 child health concerns of 2020 broken down by racial groups. So Black parents, Hispanic parents, and white parents. And what I found interesting is that I think oftentimes parents believe that their kids do not pay attention to what is going on in the world or what's happening. And what this shows is that parents realize that there is discrepancies in what they worry about based on their race and how their children will experience the world. And so I also wanted to check in to see if you guys had any thoughts about that. And I can definitely share one of the things that I noticed, for example. So you see that for Black parents, racism is number 1, where it falls to number 6 for Hispanic parents, and not at all for white parents. You also see COVID on this list. Again, it's there for Black parents and Hispanic parents, not for white parents. And that is not, separate from the fact that Black and Hispanics were the most impacted or have been the most impacted by COVID. So again, you see where we're talking about intersectionality and real world events having real complications when it relates to kids' mental health. Is there anything that you all noticed? If not, that's fine. I'll move on. Okay. So now we're going to break it down into each racial group. Amongst African Americans, Black people with mental health conditions, particularly schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, and other psychoses, are more likely to be incarcerated than people of other races. Therapeutic relationships differ for African Americans. One study found that physicians were 23% more verbal and engaged in 33% less patient-centered communication with African American participants than with their white patients. So you can imagine the importance of listening to your patient, especially when you're supposed to be diagnosing them or just building rapport with them. So that also may lead to how often folks utilize these services. African Americans often receive poor quality of care and lack access to culturally competent care. Only 1 in 3 African Americans who need mental health care services actually receives it. The rate of drug use among African Americans is slightly higher than the national average. However, the rate of alcohol use is slightly lower. And this includes heavy drinking and binge drinking as well. Okay, Karolyn, who did you say that about these? Yes, it is really interesting. I will be interested to see your thoughts on that as we get to the end. And so also compared with whites, African Americans are less likely to receive consistent care, less frequently included in research, more likely to use emergency rooms or primary care rather than mental health specialists. And this is seen throughout all races, but I do have a question to see if any of you can get it. What do you think is the highest amount of therapy sessions globally that folks attend? You're muted.
Oh God. Can you rephrase the question? What do you mean, like per week?
So overall, what do you think, like
Sure.
overall, how many sessions do you think like people of all races attend as like their most session?
Oh, I don't know. I feel like it's probably very low. It's probably not
Yes,
very
Wendy
high.
had it.
Once in
It's
a lifetime,
one.
what you said? Yeah. Oh,
Most people just
wow.
come in once and they don't come back. So the receiving consistent care is definitely really, really huge. And you can imagine how that second fact of that immediate rapport, that immediate, relationship, that vibe that people get plays a role in how frequently they come back. And most people don't realize that it takes a minute to maybe find your therapist that actually feels right for you, so they may get discouraged, and so most people come to one therapy session and don't ever come back. Great job, Whitney. So amongst Asian Americans, research shows that 2.7 million Asian Americans have a mental and/or substance use disorder. A study reported that 70% of Southeast Asian refugees receiving mental health care treatment were diagnosed with PTSD, and that was associated with immigration. Asian Americans are also least likely to seek mental health services than any other racial and ethnic group, despite the fact that suicide was a leading cause of death for Asian Americans alone, ranging from ages 15 to 24. However, the overall suicide rate for Asian Americans is half than that of non-Hispanic whites, which is also important to share. So cultural barriers are the myth of model minority, which is the belief that racial or ethnic minority groups perceive to achieve a higher degree of socioeconomic success than the population average, which therefore creates an unreasonable pressure on people to meet societal and familial expectations. And then that leads to poor mental health and their well-being. There's also a lack of understanding about mental health and the associated stigma, especially amongst first-generation immigrants, and this leads to neglecting mental health issues. Mental health is also considered weak or source of shame or burden. We also see insufficient multilingual services and lack of cultural competency amongst service providers, and that makes it difficult for folks to access mental health care treatment. And then again, we see the stigma that I acknowledged earlier and the lack of health care and insurance, especially when you think about immigration status. So I do want to differentiate between Hispanic and Latinx because I know it's a word that people often use interchangeably, but they're not the same. So Hispanic usually refers to language and those whose ancestry comes from Spain or Spanish-speaking countries. Latino or Latinx usually refers to geography and specifically to Latin America, which includes individuals from the Caribbean, South America, and Central America. So I would say that myself, I'm Latinx. And I am saying Latinx because I do want to be inclusive of all gender identities. So studies have shown that older Hispanics and Hispanic youth are especially vulnerable to psychological stresses associated with immigration and acculturation. US-born Hispanics report higher rates for most psychiatric disorders than Hispanic immigrants. Approximately 1 in 10 Hispanics with a mental disorder use mental health services from a general healthcare provider, while only 1 in 20 receive such services from a mental health specialist, which is major. So when we're talking about that once in a lifetime thing, where are you getting those services from? Among Hispanic students in grades 9 to 12, 18.9% reported considering attempting suicide. 15.7% made a plan to attempt. 11.3% actually attempted suicide. And 4.1% made a suicide attempt that resulted in an injury, poisoning, or overdose that required medical attention. Hispanic children are also half as likely as white children to use stimulants to treat disorders such as ADHD and ADD. And so Hispanic and white adolescents in 2014, aged 12 to 17, were more likely than Black or Asian adolescents to have initiated alcohol use or cigarette use. And we see the same barriers in this population: lack of insurance, lack of knowledge about mental health problems and services available, cultural stigma, language, and lack of connection, culturally competent mental health professional care. Also, when you see that bottom line that talks about stimulants for ADHD and ADD, we will come back to that because I do want to reference what that's about, but I just want to signal that for us. Also important to think about, specifically in this population, but for others as well, there's problems identifying psychiatric symptoms when the chief complaint is a somatic symptom. So this looks like folks often saying they have a headache or gastrointestinal problems, a stomach ache, or even feeling hip pains. People think that that's related to medical health, and it may be, but it also can be related to your mental health. So for women especially, we carry a lot of stress in our hips. And we also may not realize that the anxiety, the depression, the stress that we're feeling is also coming out in these other ways, like a stomach ache or a headache. For American Indian and Alaska Native population, approximately 21% reported past mental illness, compared with 17.9% of the general population. American Indian and Alaska Native children and adolescents also have the highest rate of lifetime major depressive episodes and the highest self-reported depression rates than any other racial group, which also relates to the suicide rates that you're seeing in point 2. Approximately 9% of this population also had a recurring mental illness and substance use disorder in the past year, which is 3 times the general population. And so I want to acknowledge what that's about. You often hear people say that they think marijuana or weed is a gateway drug. I and many psychologists are not of that belief. We often believe that substance use is a reflection of trying to mask or cover a lot of the pain that may be coming from these mental illnesses, depression, PTSD, anxiety, a lot of those things that are, or even past traumas that are going on. And so when you see this number, you have to think about how that relates to mental illness and what people are experiencing. Cultural factors. Traditional healing systems are an important part of treatment within this community. These systems focus on balancing the mind, the body, the spirit via connection with place and land. So some folks in this population believe that these practices have the potential to address mental health care needs within their communities. We also see economic barriers, again, the cost, lack of insurance, the lack of awareness about mental health services, and the stigma associated. So last but not least, I want to acknowledge the historical context, and this is going to be the longest part of today's presentation before I open it up to a discussion. But I do think that it's really interesting for us to base this in, because I often hear people say, you know, Black folks or Hispanic folks, Asian folks, et cetera, do not trust the mental health care system. And I don't think that that's properly putting the onus where it lies, which is that the mental health care system has done things in the past that would warrant this mistrust. And I do want to center that today. A lot of my research is predominantly in the Black community, which is the historical context that I will be providing. So using psychiatry as justification for mistreatment will lead into the segregation, which will lead into protest psychosis. So the idea that segregation was medically justified was based on a long history of racist ideas in psychiatry. Physicians and psychiatrists argued from the early 1800s that African Americans were biologically inferior. The most infamous of these physicians was Samuel Cartwright, who argued that slavery was African Americans' natural state because they benefited from the hard work and were incapable of looking after themselves outside of this system. In 1851, he published a report where he invented two psychiatric disorders. I'm probably going to mess them up because I am not aware of them. I haven't learned about them in school, but I learned about them through doing this research: drapetomania and dysesthesia aethiopica, to explain the tendencies of enslaved people to run away or to resist hard work as mental illness. Cartwright also claimed that enslaved people demonstrated childlike simplicity and a lack of complex emotional processes, which were characteristics of their entire race. Hospital superintendents justified the lack of any real therapeutic treatments for African American patients, which led into a dual system in which many hospitals where Black patients were disserviced or mistreated. So how this relates to claiming that segregation was medically necessary. So 1963, the Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act was passed to change the way with mental illness were confined. This act recognized that hospitals were too often places of custody rather than care, and provided money to states to build new community-based services. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, it included a clause that declared it illegal for any facility or service receiving federal funds to discriminate on the grounds of race. Some states that were still actively pursuing policies of racial segregation were in danger of losing existing funding and of not receiving any Medicare funding. Rather than accepting these rulings and finding ways to end discrimination and segregation, states like Alabama and Mississippi chose to fight the federal government in court. They claimed that it was their right to run state services free of federal interference and that it was medically necessary to segregate patients along racial lines. So around this same time, we get to protest psychosis. And so I'm looking through my notes to find this because it's obviously much longer. So prior to the civil rights movement, schizophrenia was described as a largely white, docile, and generally harmless condition. Mainstream magazines from the 1920s to 1950s connected schizophrenia to neurosis, and as a result, attached the term to middle-class housewives, and that's their quote. Assumptions about race, gender, and temperament of schizophrenia changed beginning in the 1960s. The American public and scientific community began to describe schizophrenia as a violent social disease, even as psychiatry took its first steps towards defining schizophrenia as a disorder of biological brain functioning. Growing numbers of research articles asserted that the disorder manifested by rage, volatility, and aggression, and was a condition that afflicted the Negro man. The cause of urban violence was now due to brain dysfunction, and the use of psychosurgery to prevent outbreaks of violence was recommended by leading neuroscientists. And so you see how this begins to affect the medical community mistrust there. And that's the beginning of the narrative that saying Black men are volatile, aggressive, angry, delusional for fighting for their basic rights. Researchers further conflated the symptoms of Black individuals with perceived schizophrenia of civil rights protest. In a 1968 article in the Archives of General Psychiatry, schizophrenia was described as a protest psychosis, in which Black men developed hostile and aggressive feelings and delusional anti-whiteness. After listening to or aligning with activist groups such as Black Power, the Black Panthers, or the Nation of Islam. The authors wrote that psychiatric treatment was required because the symptoms threatened Black men's own sanity and the social order of white America. And so boom, we see that psychiatry is getting on board, and they are also starting to show Black men in Haldol commercials at the same time. And Haldol is an antipsychotic drug. So they then start showing Black men in these commercials as assaultive and belligerent, while making mood disorders like depression, anxiety, more non-threatening, and allowing that therefore to be the space that white women hold. So the same disease, schizophrenia, that before was seen as docile when white women had it, is now being weaponized, pathologized to be aggressive, volatile based on a person's race and of gender, which is intersectionality, what we were just referencing. The Black psyche was increasingly portrayed as unwell, immoral, and inherently criminal. This helped justify the need for police brutality in the civil rights movement, Jim Crow laws, and mass incarceration in prisons and psychiatric hospitals. In general, attempts to rehabilitate took a backseat to the structural attempts to control. Some state hospitals, presided over by white male superintendents, employed unlicensed doctors to administer massive amounts of electroshock and chemical therapies and put patients to work in fields. Deplorable conditions went unchallenged as late as 1969 in some states. So, for reference, many of our parents were probably alive or babies during this. Deinstitutionalization, a government policy of closing state psychiatric hospitals and instead funding community mental health centers, began in 1955, which we just talked about. Over the next 4 decades, most state hospitals were closed, discharging those with mental illness and permanently reducing the availability of long-term care facilities. Currently, there are more than 3 times as many people with serious mental illnesses in jails and in prisons than in hospitals. The shifts in defining what constitutes mental health reflects the reality that the definition of this is shaped by social, political, and ultimately institutional factors in addition to the chemical and biological ones. So I end with presenting some discussion items. We can talk about these questions that I presented or any questions or thoughts that you all have of your own. And we have the remaining time, so feel free to use this space as you all feel is best fit. Let me see Whitney's comment here. There are reasons for the mistrust now that we can all see the facts. Yes. Thank you for this information. My question would be, what is the #1 way that we can change the way that our healthcare workers interact with and discriminate against POC? Yes, legislation itself isn't enough, fortunately. Very much so. I think it has to be a combination of the two. So we do need legislation to hold people accountable. I think it also is about education. So it isn't surprising to me that I had to go and look for this information. It's not something that I've readily been talked to about in any of my psychological studies, maybe up until my doctorate program, because I have professors that are really engaged in the intersection between social justice and mental health. So I think we have to continue to have these conversations. I think we have to normalize them in our communities. Go home and take the information that you learned today, talk to, your family members about it and hear their experiences, especially our parents, our grandparents who lived through this. They're probably the main ones that have this mistrust and understand where it's coming from. So by normalizing it for them and helping them to understand and not gaslighting them, I think is one of the major things that we can do to help our community, and continuing to educate those of us that are coming forward and hold them accountable, as well as taking a heavy anti-racist approach. It's not enough anymore to just say that you're not a racist. You have to be heavily anti-racist. And I think that also falls on the American Psychological Association, the associations that educate us and employ us to own these things and educate us on these things.
Oh, Whitney says thank you. Gosh, I had a question for you and I lost it. So if someone, let's say they see this information today, they want to educate themselves more on this so that they can take this information and help others in their family and their lives, what would be some top resources that you would recommend to them?
So the internet is really a great place. This is how I was able to find out all of this information. The American Counseling Association has a lot of articles on this, as well as the American Psychological Association. So I would definitely look out to those. I would also look out to your local community organizations that I could also imagine would have a lot more support in this as well. So cultural organizations that could also help you to find therapists that would be culturally centered and culturally engaged. I know that there was an organization, I want to believe it's called like For Black Girls, and it had Black women, Black therapists in every state that they could recommend or that were a part of this organization and were a part of taking this stance. So finding more organizations like that, I think would be really helpful and sort of increasing the amount of times people come to therapy.
Whitney, do you have anything else? or any thoughts on any of the questions on the screen.
Mhm. I also want to acknowledge, just in case anyone doesn't know, but we maybe all do, BIPOC stands for Black and Indigenous People of Color, and also for the folks that may watch it and don't know what that acronym is. So yes, and so with that question, it's also, increasing a lot of things that we talked about, making sure there's more than 2% of our population that is reflected in mental health care providers. Also, I think the major thing that people often don't realize is how insurance is both a blessing and a curse. Of course, it helps people get in the door, it helps to cover the cost of mental health care, but there's also a big thing that psychologists don't like is that insurance often requires you to diagnose and therefore over pathologize, and that adds to the stigma because people want to be able to just come to a therapist to vent and to talk and not feel like they're going to have a stain, so to speak, on their record. So that's also one of the downsides of insurance, is that it also declares what kind of care that you can get and who you can get access and services to. So if you have an insurance company that in your area they don't have that insurance as their provider, then you have to pay out of pocket to be able to see that person. Similarly to where therapists are located, rural areas versus urban, how frequently can people get to them? How does transportation relate to that? Those are all of those concerns that we think about. Yeah. Yes, very much so. So Whitney, to your point, you want to use patient or person-centered words. So you would never want to say like the disabled person or the depressed person. You would want to say the person who is depressed or the person who has a disability. Person-centered first, so that you acknowledge that you're seeing the person and not sort of what they're presenting for, before anything else. Is that what you're? Oh yes, and also when you're speaking to people, using terms that they themselves would use to describe their community, which you see, even when we're talking about the Washington football team, which previously had a previous name. So you want to make sure that you are referring to people as they would like to be referred to. And that also goes with respecting a person's gender identity, because that can be fluid. So even if you have a patient that is, what's the word I'm looking for, like struggling, or they're not, I want to say struggling, questioning their gender identity, you want to respect their pronouns, and so where they're at with that. So for example, I have a patient who is coming to terms with identifying as non-binary, but he would still like to be referred to as he, him, his, and so that's what I respect. But whenever he gets to the point, if he gets to the point that he would like to change that, I'm with that as well. So you want to follow whatever your patients are giving you, and respect their boundaries as well for their comfort level and all these things, and not push them. Yep.
This was also wonderful. I think it's so important and just a great thing to remember as we go through this weekend and we talk more about the different aspects of wellness, remembering that this doesn't look the same for everyone and that not everyone is necessarily getting equal and equitable care. So just remembering that as we talk about all of these different types of wellness over the weekend, I think that's so important. And I just want to honor all the work you're doing. I think this is so great and you're doing so much. You're in school, you're a naval officer. I have so much love and respect for our troops. My dad was in the military. He was in the Army for 25 years. So I know that you're doing amazing things. I can't wait to see you on the Miss DC stage. I know you're going to be phenomenal, and I'll be cheering you on from here in North Carolina. And thank you so
Thank
much.
you. And likewise, I will be cheering you on. And thank your dad for his service. And Whitney, I will be cheering you on in Arkansas as well. So
Yeah.
good luck and thank you for joining us.
Yes. Thank you so much, Whitney. Have a good
Bye.
one.